Want to learn about public policy with a group of curious fellow learners? Apply for the 12-week graduate certificate in public policy. Early bird deadline closes 27th July.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I am Pranay Kutastane and it's a long time coming back on All Things Policy. I'm back here because I wanted to discuss technology, geopolitics in more detail. This is one domain where the practice precedes theory, just like how atomic weapons were used before the theories of mutually assured destruction and other things came into being. We are actually at a similar stage in technology, geopolitics in general, where the practice precedes theory. There are very few books and resources trying to articulate why the things are happening the way they are happening in technology, geopolitics. And that's why it's a very interesting area of research for people in public policy. While searching for books and resources for this, I came across a very interesting book called The Tech Cold War, which is written by Ansgar, Baums, and Nicholas Butts. And this was a really interesting book which tries to theorize the technology, geopolitics, and the way it's operating over the last few years. So I thought, let's do an episode with Ansgar, who's one of the co-authors of this book, and he's also senior advisor at Synolytics, to understand his view on technology, geopolitics, and hopefully that will be of great interest to our listeners as well. So, Ansgar, welcome to All Things Policy.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Pranay.
Yeah, Ansgar, so let's get started right up front. Why do you think is technology at the forefront of geopolitical contestation? You know, geopolitical contestation can happen over land, it can happen over economy, and it has happened over economics, etc. in the past as well. But why is technology currently at the forefront of this contestation?
Very good and fundamental question. I would argue that geopolitics has always been only about one thing, which is power. And whatever is important to power will be subject or will be a matter of geopolitical competition. So if land or geography is important to power projection, it will be in scope. If economic development is key to project power or to accumulate power, it will be, geopoliticized. And the same goes for technology. And arguably, if you think about geopolitics then in a historical perspective, sometimes it looks like geography is important, but maybe it's not the independent variable, right? So maybe geography is only important because it plays a certain role in context of something like technology or economic projection. So from that perspective, I'd argue that the very name geopolitics is probably historically bound to a time when geography was very important for particular reasons we can discuss. But maybe it was wrong to call it actually geopolitics because, maybe geography is a dependent variable, not an independent one.
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, even like you said, technology is a component of national power. And since contestation in international space is about power, essentially, and relative power to be specific, whatever elements constitute power, confrontation can happen over them. But it's interesting that in some phases of history, technology comes at the forefront. And like you write in your book, it's not just that right now the contestation is happening over technology. You write about this idea during the Second World War, how there was contestation over rubber, and synthetic rubber was the technology that a lot of countries were chasing at that time. And we also saw that in the period between 60s, 70s, when there was the Cold War and the idea of the Sputnik movement, etc. So it seems as though there are some phases where technology rises up the priorities of governments, and they start thinking, man, this is the thing that's really important for my national power, and if another country gets ahead from me in this domain, it's going to be a battle lost, so let me concentrate my energies on that. So what determines this changing perceptions? Have you thought about that?
Yeah. Yes, I mean that's exactly the, let's say, the question why we are now in or everybody thinks that we are now in this tech race, right? Right now everything is framed as a race. So just 2 days ago, the new AI strategy of the White House was released, and the predominant framing of AI is basically, oh, it's a race, and we want to win this race, right? I find it kind of funny, as if there is if technology is anything, it's an race that never stops, right? So there's no finish line, right? So winning the race is kind of a funny framing, which probably makes politically sense to give the whole effort a time frame that you need to allocate budgets, whatever. But from a technology's perspective, it's not that way, right? Technology never ends, so there is no finish line. But maybe going back to your first point, so I think there are several ways in which technology changes geopolitics. The example that we have in the book that you mentioned is synthetic rubber. So if you think this through, access to rubber was absolutely key for military and industrial purposes. So the regions where natural rubber could be harvested were of geopolitical prime concern, right? So it was important. So therefore, Southeast Asia saw lots of interest by colonial powers, be it Japan or be it Great Britain and the Netherlands and France, whatever. So rubber lended a certain geopolitical importance because that natural resource was important for an industrial application. Now, what changed the whole thing was basically a technological invention, right? So the creation of synthetic rubber, it was an invention in a chemistry lab in Germany. Interesting, but not fascinating for some time, as long as there was access to natural rubber. But with the Second World War, then, synthetic rubber became really, really important. And it made Southeast Asian rubber growing islands less important. So think this through. It means, in the end, a piece of technology assigned geopolitical relevance to a geography or took it away. So you see how fundamentally technology can change of what we think is geography or and therefore geopolitically relevant. You could make the same argument about oil, right? So oil would be completely uninteresting if it wasn't for the combustion engine. So the whole idea that the Middle East is shaped by the geopolitics of oil is kind of, not really true, because in the end, it's the geopolitics of the combustion engine that shaped the Middle East. So again, a piece of technology shaped more fundamentally how we think about geography and the geopolitical importance of geography than anything else, right? So this is where, in the end, you could argue technology very much determines what geopolitics is really about on a very fundamental level. And then you have situations where, and this often goes unnoticed, that's the funny thing, right? So which geopolitician has contemplated that much about the importance of chemistry labs or the importance of what was invented with the combustion engine? There are these moments, though, when then technology becomes front and center in political thinking. And right now we're in one of these moments when you have, again, this kind of, now we're in a tech race. We need to make sure that we are ahead of, or we do not, our enemies, competitors do not get access to certain pieces of technology. I think this is also a reoccurring theme. So we know that the Assyrians tried to control the dissemination of their technology. Most important weapon platform back then was the chariot. So some dude on a platform racing through the infantry and shooting arrows, whatever. That was high tech, and they tried to control the dissemination of this technology, right? And you can go through history. You can see swords in the Middle Age. What kind of technologies? Always there was this idea of we as a state try to control the dissemination of these technologies. Now, the special moment that we are in right now is, of course, that the technologies that governments try to control are not only weapons related. they're not even only dual use related. They basically apply to what we would call a general purpose technology. And this makes it so difficult, right? Because general purpose technologies are basically everywhere in the economy. So AI is supposed to be everywhere. And still we try to control the dissemination of AI and control access to it. And this is the policy tension, the policy puzzle that we're currently seeing. Like, how do you actually control something that's supposed to be everywhere and spread quickly like a general purpose technology?
Yeah, fascinating because, and I would recommend our listeners, there's a nice paper called National Power After AI, which also says how technology changes national power. And there are three ways, like what Ansgar mentioned. One, it can introduce new elements of national power, or it could change the coefficients of existing elements of national power, or the third way it can impact national power is actually it changes intermediate goals that nation states change. So really fascinating part. Ansgar, I have one point here to discuss about how metaphors matter in this. You mentioned about the metaphor of a race being used, but you also use a metaphor called war, right? Tech Cold War. Now again, war is a metaphor which necessarily means it's a zero sum game, but we know technology is largely a positive sum game. And so how do you make sense of this? Why is this a tech cold war, and why not just a tech competition?
Yeah, good question. I mean, in the end, we lent this the wording of the Cold War because we think it captures how policymakers right now think about it, particularly in Washington. So if you go to Washington, the whole idea that technology is not a zero sum game, not the case anymore, right? And that's the fundamental shift in how how US policymakers are thinking about technology. Just go back 30 years, 20 years, 25 years, the whole idea of actually supporting the spread of US technology was all the rage, right? So think about Bill Clinton, democracy will follow the modem, the whole with our technology, with the internet, democracy will spread. That was basically a belief system that dominated policymaking in Washington for decades after 1990 in the unipolar moment. And that has shifted completely towards we need to control the dissemination of these technologies because with them goes political power. And therefore, we now literally have this idea of zero sum thinking about technology. And on top of this, we also see that policy concepts that were born in zero sum policy environments like containment are also now back and are now basically the blueprint of policy tool invention that we see in particularly in Washington, right? So I think we're back in that kind of space of zero sum policy thinking, and therefore we found it interesting to contemplate how this compares to the last time we actually were in that situation of geopolitical zero sum competition, like in the Cold War. Plus the question, how do you actually get from something which is almost to a destructive level structured around zero sum thinking into a phase which is more cooperative or opens a space for cooperation despite of competition, which is, I think, an urgent question. How do we actually achieve this? Because we need cooperation, international cooperation. The planet is burning. Climate change doesn't stop simply because we have some geopolitical zero-sum thinking going on, right? So, and we cannot tackle climate change without cooperation, global cooperation. And this is why we want to, basically focus attention on the question of how did we achieve actually a limited level of cooperation during the Cold War when lots of stuff was at stake, but still there were ways, best practice on how to actually cooperate across the wire.
Yeah, that's very interesting because until now, the US strategy, at least 4 or 5 years ago, was to outpace your adversary. The best way is to make them dependent on your technology so that at least you can control the pace of your adversary. But that idea seems to have flipped, and now it is about how China will go ahead of us. So let us stop things from going there. And interestingly, that relates to the next question I had, and this is about, you referred to this, how the technologies of today are not only dual use, but they are also not necessarily in charge. That it's not necessarily that governments are in charge of those technologies, right? Private enterprises are at the forefront. So I distinguish between old tech and new tech. Old tech like space, nuclear was largely for the government, even if others were producing it. So the capital outlay demands were smaller, and the customers were largely government, which meant that you could indigenize a lot of them substantially as well, because the demands are not very high. But new technologies which we are talking about, whether it is AI, or even I can classify broadly advanced semiconductors there, the capital outlay demands are huge, and the only way you make that kind of revenue is by selling to the whole wide world, not necessarily to a few governments, and only then you can plow back some things into R&D and things like that, right? So this means that private companies are really at the forefront of it, right? So how are they negotiating this is the main idea in your book as well. So tell us, what are private companies trying to do, because they are right in the center of it, whether they like it or not. So how are they trying to negotiate this moment?
Yeah, that's basically that was the starting point for Nick and me thinking about writing this book, because we both worked in a private company, IT company, US company, HP, and we had to deal with the geopolitical regulation that came, that hit HP left and right. And we thought that companies are not well understood in the policy bubble on how they will react, because companies have their own logic on how to actually deal with these interferences, which are basically a risk to your business, and you need to manage them according to these risk management parameters, right? So what does it mean? Well, I'm not a fan of equating state and company power. They operate on very different level, but corporations are definitely a factor that you need to understand when you try to contemplate, like, where are we actually going with this large scale tech dissemination control policies that are currently applied. And the reason we think this is important is that you could argue that if the wish of a government expressed in regulation is framed by a corporation as a risk, and it tries to minimize its risk exposure, that's a friction point. This is where the actions of government and corporations are not aligned at all. And historically, this is always happening when you have a situation where a hegemon is challenged by a new power. And on the side of the hegemon, you have then this split between corporate interests and government interests. So go back to history, end of 19th century, when the German Empire was challenging the British Empire. The British government was very keen to stop British companies from doing business with Germany, right? But British companies really like to continue that relationship. So you had within the British Empire, you had this friction. On the German side, it wasn't a problem, because they were both trying to internationalize, globalize, export, whatever. So you had strong alignment on the side of the challenger between industry and government, but you had no alignment between industry and government on the hegemon side. And this basically is a reflection of what we see today. So in Washington, there's lots of tension between corporations and the government, because they're not on the same page. Forget about all the, taking the knee, in front of Trump, etc. That's tactical. But fundamentally, these companies are struggling because they need global markets to sell their very expensive technologies, right? I mean, they invested billions in it, so they need to capture that. How do you do that? You need the largest possible total addressable market, including China. And if your own government says, like, China no more, you run into real problems. So that's the situation to start from. And then if you look at the implementation level, corporations will restructure according to these geopolitical risks. And one of this restructuring might affect how you actually do business in China in the future. And if you decide that Chinese TAM is too important to your company to abandon it, you will basically restructure your corporation in a way that separates the Chinese operations as much as possible from the rest of world operations, to make it less vulnerable to geopolitical regulation. And this kind of splitting the company in two and doubling down on China is what we see with many Western companies, and basically not doing what governments were expecting them to do, right? Which is de-risking, doing less business in China, etc. pp. So it's a very complicated game for policymakers to acknowledge that in the end they don't play a large role in the tech value chain. They don't own the tech assets. They don't own the R&D. They basically own the regulatory level. And trying to invent policies that actually are effective despite all these constraints, despite hyper-globalized value chains, that's a source of frustration because it's not easy. And this is where we see, lots of tensions right now in DC and lots of frustration on policymakers' side that, we did all these great export controls and see what happened. In reality, not that much, right? So, and that's I think where we are, and where we see a whack-a-mole game between new regulations, companies getting smart about them and adapting, then another wave of regulation. In the end, we see this kind of back and forth, which creates this very odd dynamic that we currently see playing out.
Yeah, and we are talking this in a week when Nvidia's H20 sales resume to China as well. That's like a canonical case of what you explained. And I was thinking you have a very interesting concept called the geopolitical enterprise, how companies will try to sort of manage these tensions by either separating their businesses or supply chains without giving up on China completely. Now, that's an interesting dynamic because at some level, companies are now more aware that China also does many market unfriendly practices, which are a problem for the entire world. The classic case being how it has suddenly stopped rare earth magnet exports, which was a very basic component which the world was happy buying from China, but now it is saying it can do these restrictions in the future as well. So companies do want to align with the governments because they realize China is not a fair player. But on the other hand, you can't even give up on China because your market is too huge, and even the world's biggest company still wants to sell things in China, right? So which are the companies you think will be able to stand up to the governments, and which are the companies which will fold up and say, okay, we'll listen to what the mandarins in White House are saying?
Mm-hmm. So I think there will be a polarization between companies. There will be many companies who will think about the future and think about China and saying like, market share is going down anyhow because of Chinese competition. All these controls, all the geopolitical risks, it's probably not worth it in the long run. So you basically treat China as a cash cow, meaning you try to sell as long as you can, but you do not invest in new products. You will probably sell assets at some point, and then you exit China within the foreseeable future, right? That's what probably a lot of companies will do. But then on the other side, you will have companies are saying like, China, we have to be there. And not only for the TAM, but also because it's such an innovative ecosystem. So I just talked to a manager of one of the biggest software companies globally. He said like, we need to be in China because it's interesting stuff happening there. They're really good. So we learn from them and we want to be there, right? So, and if China is that important to you, you will change your cooperation accordingly. And we call this the geopolitical enterprise because you will optimize your cooperation, your cash flow, your HR management, your business operations, your IT infrastructure, how you handle customer data, your procurement, your supply chain. You will basically optimize all of this to be less vulnerable to geopolitical regulation. And that means you basically expand your footprint in China because you will produce more in China for China. And in China for China until now meant that you basically try to sell a global product that you produce in China. In the future, we think you have to incorporate Chinese tech because Chinese tech will be distinct and you will not be able to sell a Western IT stack-based product in China anymore. So you need Chinese compute, you need Chinese encryption, you need Chinese cloud infrastructures, Chinese imagery data, whatever. So anything connected in China needs to be based on genuine Chinese IT. We call it the split IT stack model. And that means, again, you will increase your R&D needs will have to increase funding to actually be competitive in China. So that means, counterintuitively, geopolitical regulation in some cases will mean that corporations are actually doubling down on the Chinese market, spend more money there, and become even more, let's say, bipolarized in the way of business operations than in the past.
That's very interesting. I have a bunch of things to discuss on that. But before this, I wanted to understand, since US, China, and Europe, India, these are some bigger players, Japan, etc., Southeast Asia. I wanted to understand, since you're in Europe, what is the European perspective on the tech Cold War? And I know there'll be many perspectives, but I want to understand which is the more dominant one. Has there been any change in with respect to how Europe is thinking about this issue?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, we don't like it. That's, I think, the most important thing. So Europe has been optimized to be a beneficiary of the unipolar moment and of a hyper-globalized world, right? So that was the ideal environment for the European business model. And the whole geopolitical game for Europe is not great, and we're not equipped for it. So the European Union itself was never meant to be a geopolitical entity. It was a globalization optimization mechanism. And you can tell that the whole framing of we need to have a geopolitical European Commission, etc., doesn't really work, because anything related to national security is simply not in the EU has no competency there. That's still national member state territory, right? So it doesn't have the tools. So export controls, the EU cannot do anything about it. So it's a very, let's say, complicated picture. The thing that strikes me most is that Europe discusses the geopolitical situation almost as if there is an equidistance towards China and the US, right? Which I find, let's say, geopolitically long-term very problematic. I don't think that Europe can maintain an equidistance between China and the US. That's not how the geopolitics will play out in the future. So Europe will be firmly remain committed to the transatlantic economic sphere. This is where European companies will grow and have to grow. So the US will always be closer to Europe than China ever will be. However, if you look at how we discuss geopolitics right now, it's all about Trump and the threat of the US killing off access to US hyperscaler clouds in Europe. So if you just read the news, you might think that the US is actually the bigger long-term threat to Europe than China is, which I'm not sure that this is a correct assessment, right? But this is where we are mentally. You can almost, like, it's this kind of, it has been a long-term relationship between Europe and US. And now that it's no longer like love, right? There's a lot of bad feelings between the two. And it's this, we spent lots of time in contemplating, like, how disappointed we are from the US. And we don't think really much about the bigger picture that is even more important than Mr. Trump.
Right. All right. So let's move to some of the questions about the future of how these things might pan out. And you mentioned about the US. So I want to begin there, that first there were restrictions that you write about. Trump brought in on Huawei and ZTE were initial restrictions. Then you had the Biden administration, which sort of continued a lot of them but made them structured. And then there was this idea that the NSA, Jake Sullivan, talked about small yard, high fence. That was, have some areas which are very critical to national security. There will be high fences, and China will not get access to those technologies easily. That was how it started. But by the end of it, US was also stopping connected car technologies. I don't know what is national security in that. Or then there was also this idea that there are some routers in the shipping cranes which are being used, and they can have a lot of restrictions. So it went quickly from being small yard, high fence to large yard, high fence for everything. And then you also had these notions of mutually assured AI malfunction and how AI diffusion should be stopped, etc. So how sustainable do you think this model is? Is this even a good model to think of, or do we need to think differently? Can you restrict some advanced technologies, a really small set, to your adversary? And if yes, what would be a better way to do it?
Mm-hmm. So we call this attempt to achieve geopolitical goals by focusing on technology value chains. We call that geotech statecraft, right? And think of geotech statecraft as this kind of toolbox, regulatory toolbox that you have. And this toolbox hasn't been updated for decades during the unipolar moment. So not much happened there. Export controls, no one used them really, only for dual use and military goods. So it was very stale and boring. Tariffs were not anything you would do. Import restrictions, investment controls, not very interesting. And then you have this wave of new tool development or updating tools. And then you see this explosion of using these tools. Basically, end of Obama, it started and then it continued. So there's lots of continuity there, right? There are ups and downs and preferences for different tools. But in the end, you could argue since the end of Obama years, the application of geotech statecraft in Washington has exponentially increased. And there are different tools in this box. And I'd say the small yard, high fence idea is basically about using export controls to restrict access to a small class of technologies that are considered so important that they're basically key not only to economic competition, but literally they are key to develop next generation military technology platforms. This is why the high-end semiconductors were put under restrictions. And this is when the Jake Sullivan, framed it as small yard, high fence. The problem there is, of course, as I said, that companies react to it. So if you put a threshold, performance threshold in regulation on high-end semiconductors, sure, companies will put out a product which is just underneath the threshold, right? And this is what the H20 chip of NVIDIA was. And this frustrated US government, and they were complaining. And NVIDIA said, we did what you wanted us to do, right? We produced something which is underneath the threshold, so it should be legal. US government said, no, you violated the spirit of our regulation, so we'll put another control on it. And NVIDIA was just like, what the hell? So, and it's this whack-a-mole game that's ongoing there. So you can already see how difficult it is to stay true to the promise of a small yard. In the end, you cannot control how big the yard is as US government. Why? Because you don't own it. You don't own the yard, right? It's basically corporation's yard. So they will have a say on how big the yard will be and what they're actually doing. Plus, you will also have to count in China. So how China reacts to these controls. And in the end, China was always very good in asymmetric response. So if you hurt them with semiconductor export controls, they might hurt you with rare earth export controls. And then what? How do you react? You add more pressure, so you grow the yard again. So the size of the yard is not defined by US government alone. And this is, I think, something that they underestimated. And then you end up in the situation where basically everything becomes kind of subject to these controls, which is a problem. That's number one. Number two is you mentioned the controls on connected vehicles and on shipping cranes. So these are incoming controls, right? So this is about what kind of technology is supposed to run in the US. And it's interesting to focus on what I would call the theory of harm behind these regulations. The idea is that anything related to personal data is now a matter of national security in the US. That's a radically new framing. You remember that we had for years this discussion between Europe focused on privacy and the US didn't give a damn. Now you see the US gives a damn about data, but not for privacy purposes, but because of national security. So the idea is, if you have a Chinese car, that's basically one huge sensor roaming American streets, collecting all kinds of data that could be put to use to extort US citizens, to collect information about critical infrastructures, whatever. So you don't want that. So you basically put an import ban on anything connected coming out of China. right? That's the logic behind the ICTS connected vehicles. That's the logic behind another ICTS we might see soon on drones or whatever, or on kitchen appliances, smart home devices. I'm pretty sure that there is no future for connected devices from China in the US market. And if you look at the cranes, it's a similar scenario where you have sensoric devices in a critical infrastructure, and you're not sure if they are leaking data to China. So the theory of harm is, access to data is a national security problem. And the second theory of harm is that even if we would tear these devices apart and would check all the functionalities, etc., pp. of them, we still cannot be sure because the next update might include a backdoor. So the theory of harm is basically there is no way that we can, based on objective criteria, assess a risk of a connected device, because this device is not a fixed thing, it's ever evolving, and the next software update might be the problem. So what do you do then? If you cannot attest the security of a device, you basically say, well, if that's the case, I need to rely on the trustworthiness of the component's producer. And if that's a Chinese company, I do not have any trust. So what does it mean? You basically block the imports of these devices by saying, if it's from China, we do not trust them. So there you go. That's the end of market access. And this is what's currently happening in the US. And if you think it through, it's very clear that in the future, I don't see much room for, as I said, Chinese device makers accessing the Chinese market. And vice versa, it will also mean that China will make sure that equally such devices running in China will also not be produced by companies that they don't regard as trustworthy anymore.
So that's a very interesting dynamic. And I was wondering on the China point itself. Now, how susceptible is China's technology stack to these shocks as well, right? Because there are two things happening. One, critical FDI, which was responsible for a lot of things happening in China, is now not going to happen in very critical areas because of the geopolitics around it, and maybe for good reasons as well. The second is China's digital exports are perceived very differently from its physical exports, right? We can buy a dumb exported rare earth magnet from China, but we will not even India or any other country sees Chinese digital exports differently. We also know how TikTok is being used to sway political opinions in Taiwan, for example. So it does face a threat that Chinese exports will be seen differently. So how do you think China's gameplay in this is? Don't you think they also have a lot of weaknesses which people are not assuming in this gameplay? What's your assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think we need to understand that China is not a homogeneous thing, right? As there is a tension between US companies and US government, there's also a lot of tensions between Chinese companies and the Chinese government. So Alibaba is probably not on the same page with global market expansion as with the Chinese government. And we saw actually, a couple of years back when Chinese big tech was clashing heads on with government and, with multi-billion dollar market cap evaporating because of this conflict. So don't think that China is one player. It's as complex as any other big society. So that's number one. And we don't get this nuance at all, right? So if I see how China is discussed, usually it's just kind of as if there is this pyramid, and on top of the pyramid is President Xi, and he has basically this huge dashboard, and he tells everybody what to do, and everybody follows along. That's ridiculous. So that's something we don't capture usually when we discuss Chinese tech. That's number one. Number two, I think the focus of Chinese government right now is to minimize dependencies on Western tech in key parts of the IT stack. So you see that Harmony OS has been launched to make China IoT mobile sector independent of Android or any other Western controlled OS launched. huge success, apparently. I mean, guaranteed success almost, right? Because Chinese government was very clear that, if Huawei invests billions into HarmonyOS development, it will basically has a guaranteed addressable market, which is all of China. So pretty amazing that US export controls, basically solved a big problem for Huawei, which is kind of stupid from a US perspective. But anyhow, this is how it goes. So you see these targeted investments in becoming less dependent on Western tech and the stack. And we think that in the future, we will also see this on the compute architecture level. So good candidate will be RISC-V. So you will see some kind of Chinese derivative that will make China independent of ARM compute architectures. So you see all these investments on the stack to be less vulnerable to US controls. That's for sure. The interesting question, of course, is how will Chinese tech expand, right? So right now we see a lot of the growth of Chinese IT outside of China is driven by the big guys, usually on the, with an B2C focus, e-commerce focus, very successful in Southeast Asia, expanding. And I think this is what we will see for the time being. The most interesting crunch point, and there's not much to compete from the US, by the way, right? I mean, which US e-commerce platform has been successful in Southeast Asia? It's a market where China seems to be better equipped to actually dominate that level, right? Same goes for cloud, by the way. So the big cloud, Chinese hyperscaler cloud infrastructures, they follow these commerce platforms, right? Because it's a synergy almost, where you can see that expansion in that space makes sense. So that will continue. The interesting, let's say, where the US basically tries to draw a line in the sand is basically using access to AI compute. So if you see how as I mentioned, the new AI strategy, basically this AI race is basically what's in there is basically saying, if you as a country want access to the newest, latest AI compute power delivered to you via a hyperscaler cloud, this will come with conditions. And these conditions will be something like get rid of Huawei equipment in your 6G, whatever, right? So there will be a quid pro quo. And that's basically putting countries in a situation where they have to choose, right? So do I want access to AI made in the US, or am I keen to stick to Chinese tech? And then you make a decision. So this already happened. So we know about the Kenya deal, where the BIS was apparently part of the negotiations team. We see the same playing out in Saudi, in the Gulf region, and it might be the same playbook applied everywhere. So in the end, here is your access to US AI compute, but if you want to have it, this is our list of demands. And I think many countries will not appreciate this, right? Because if you think about historically, like when, also in the Cold War again, this kind of are you for or against us is exactly the kind of situation that is so detested by any other country who wants to be non-aligned. And this is, again, where I think it's kind of interesting to think in historical patterns. So I think this kind of are you for or against us was the least successful strategy in the Cold War. It led to huge blunders. It was strategically stupid. So I'm just questioning, is it a good thing to pressure third countries in that situation? I'm not sure. I don't think it's wise.
Right. Yeah. I think from an Indian perspective, there have been a lot of questions, especially with AI diffusion kind of rules coming in and saying that there'll be thresholds from the US side. But in the Indian case, the idea that Chinese technologies might have other ramifications is a much more predominant idea. And hence, India still wants to collaborate with the West more and more, and rather than thinking of allowing Chinese digital exports to flood the Indian market. So I guess, but that dynamic is different in different countries. Like you said, Southeast Asia might embrace China more easily than some other countries. So my last...
Just on this one, sorry. But again, I mean, yes, collaboration, and of course, India wants access to US compute and AI. But I think equally, India is not keen to lose access to cooperating with the Chinese market, right? So in the end, I mean, Yashankar has been very clear how he thinks about this, right? It's not about fixed alliances from an Indian perspective. It's about having a choice and being able to basically pivot according to your interests. So room to maneuver, not being forced in this binary choice, this is what Indian foreign policy will be all about. And I can imagine easily that Indian companies will actually focus on providing services that, allow to bridge the gaps between two separate IT stacks. So if I think what would be a business model where I see Indian companies operating, basically if it becomes really difficult to operate as a global corporation with business in the US and with business in China, this is creating friction. And usually Indian companies have been very good in, managing friction and solving it for customers. So in that sense, I think China is a natural candidate for trying to be kind of, open to both sides, not appreciating being put in that position to have to choose. This has always been one of the core fundamental points of, discontent that India had with the US when it was forced. So I think there will be lots of historical continuity in that regard with Indian foreign policy. But keen to get your point because you're much more an expert in Indian foreign policy than I am.
No, I think differently on this question because the backstops with respect to China are really more firmed up because of our border question and the fact that, from a very realistic viewpoint, you have two adversaries sharing borders and those borders are not going to be resolved soon. So there's a fundamental tension. So India sees China differently. In fact, India's services companies have very little presence in China, and the Great Firewall has stopped Indian companies from operating there. So when India says this, because the word alliances doesn't fit with India well, but it generally means India wants to do things with Europe and US and other countries a lot more than China, because and with respect to China, it is more about allowing imports of certain things which then India can build on and sell, rather than allowing consumer products or even markets, because India's exports to China and presence of services in China is very low. Anyways, moving on from the India point, I just want to end this by asking you about how do you see this panning out from a broader perspective, right? Is there a wave that many countries will realize this, hey, we've gone too far, and then again we will enter an era of interdependence? Is that more likely, or do you see this going even further down an era where things will separate out and we'll have separate stacks for everything on the digital side?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, I just thought about this last night when I just again reading a book about the Cold War history, and it seems like the Cold War had different phases, right? And the pivoting from one phase to another usually required, was basically triggered by an event, by something happening, which made became famous events like the Sputnik moment or the Cuban crisis. So you have this kind of event that are crystallizing, structuring a time. And they do this because it's this recognition point where people are forced to think about risks. So the Cuban crisis basically made it clear to everyone in charge that, Jesus, this could have been the end of humanity here. Why? Because we made policy choices before that led us to this point. So we need to change, right? So establishing then more robust communication channels between Moscow and DC was one of the immediate outcomes of the Cuban crisis, and it was this kind of, maybe we need to cooperate on nuclear proliferation because this was scary. So. And in that regard, I'm rather a pessimist. I don't think that people will come to senses just by, this kind of steady process. There will be disruption points. There will be crises that will change how we think about it. But this crisis will happen. And hopefully they don't escalate. I mean, that's the thing that makes me like think about, the Taiwan situation, ZWP. We're in a bad shape to handle a hot crisis right now because no one is communicating. We don't have good connectivity between US and Chinese military. We have very nationalistic sentiments on both sides, right? If you look at social media in China, it's as toxic as, X is in the US. So what's the room to maneuver for politicians who don't want to appear weak and whatever? So there's a lot already building up, which is very bad when you think about what will a crisis actually trigger. So yeah, I'm in that regard, I'm rather pessimistic, and I think it's much worse than many people think. But then there's hopefully this catharsis attached to these crises, where you basically then have this mindset shift, saying like, okay, we probably made bad choices that led us to here. Let's try to be more, let's change where we're going. And these disruptive events, that's interesting, right? These crisis events, they could basically be random. I mean, it might even be like a radical climate event that might actually trigger like, Jesus, we really need to cooperate on climate, because we just saw what happened. Natural catastrophes can change how societies think about themselves. So in the new book, we discussed briefly like the big earthquake in Lisbon in the 18th century, which basically eradicated Lisbon. And it was a natural disaster, so nothing to do with politics, but it changed how people in Europe thought about enlightenment, about the future, about progress, because it was such a shock to the system, right? So yeah, I think this is how change will occur in fundamental thinking. Unfortunately, it will be event driven. It will therefore be unpredictable, random, and let's hope we have the right, let's say, the resilience to the right mindset to turn a crisis into something positive then.
Right. I hope people do read your book and get this message about thinking about technology in positive sum games instead of zero sum ideas. So with that, we'll end this episode. Thanks so much, Ansgar. This was great to hear your perspective. And I'll encourage all our listeners to buy this book, The Tech Cold War, and do give it a read. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.